In this video, I'm going to show you how to document your REST API, your server, multi-tier server, in a very easy and efficient way. Here, first, I will start showing the server that I have already built. Here I have my Xdata application, which is very simple. I will just overview it. Here we have the components that create the initial server to start the server. This data model doesn't have anything. And these two units here, math service and math service implementation, are the effective endpoints of my server, my business logic. Here is in this example is very simple. Our focus here is not the business logic, just the documentation. So that in Xdata I have this interface, two interfaces. In this first example, arithmetic service, so a set of arithmetic functions, and we have like add method, subtract method, power method, and we have a trigonometry service with functions to calculate sine and cosine. All right. So what Xdata needs to implement this is this interface, this layer, which holds the endpoints, and in this unity the actual implementation, which are simply the implementation of that interface that I show you. So just simple things here. We are not going to focus on this, but implementation of add method is just adding two variables, the two parameters, power, subtractions, just simple implementation for all methods. The server is basically that. So if I run the server application now and try to execute one endpoint, invoke an endpoint, for example, those interfaces will create this endpoint. For example, /tms, /math, /arith, /add, passing the a and b parameters. And here we have the result, 5 plus 7, 12. So our server is working with that configuration. Like you said, the first problem is, how do I know from my Xdata server I have, if I was the front-end developer, how do I know which URL I have to build and how to pass the parameters to invoke the endpoint? That's the problem with the documentation, with the REST documentation. That's what documentation is for. So Xdata first has a so-called feature which is like an automatic documentation, which is an implicit documentation. I will illustrate here. This is the one client application that I've built for this server. This client is very simple. We have here a user interface here to execute the endpoints in the server. So the client is implementation like this. It's just instantiate a client. We say the URL of the base URL of the Xdata server, and I use the same unit, math service, which has the interfaces implementation. I share the same unit between server and client. So in the client, I don't have to write any additional line of code to invoke server methods. I just use this interface. I ask for the interface for the client, give me my arithmetic service, and I just use that interface. So the code is just this. All I do is call interface methods, for example, to calculate the sum of two numbers. I just call arithmetic.add to retrieve the value. I will execute it here. So 3 plus 2, 5, 10 minus 9, 1, the calculation of sine and cosine. All these clicks I'm doing here are calling these interface methods here, which in turn are executing HTTP requests. This is what the methods are doing, executing the HTTP request. So the first documentation things that Xdata give to us is that is so the other developers know what the server offers to us. So the first automatic documentation that Xdata provides is that the fact that if I'm writing a client code in Delphi, I can work with interfaces. So for example, this trigonometry interface, if I type trigonometry dot, the code completion lists to me as a client developer, I have the list, for example, of all the methods from that interface that are available in the server. So I know here, just from the code completion, that the server provides me sin and cos methods for me from that interface. So I can see not only the methods, but which parameters they receive, the type of parameters, the type that the function returns, and this not documentation, but this benefit is that I can use these methods directly from the interface, and I don't need to know which URL I have to build, how to pass the parameters, should I pass that parameter as integer, as a string, or how to pass a date. So I don't have to know anything of that, because all I have to do is type the interface, use the method, and pass the parameters as if they were, they are actually just regular Delphi parameters. So this is the first level of documentation between codes that Xdata offers to us. The list of the methods and the parameters, type safe. Okay, but if I'm not writing a client in Delphi, if I have a front-end developer writing in Angular or React or developing in any other non-Delphi framework, so then we have the Swagger, a very popular specification that we can enable here just in a simple property. Sets two properties here, where the Xdata provides a specific UI where it's also an automatic documentation. It will list to me this graphical user interface where it lists all the endpoints already available in my server in a way that any client, non-Delphi clients, can use. So for example, to invoke the add method, it lists the get method, the HTTP method, the URL, and of course from here I can test it. It shows me the parameters that it receives. I can execute. It shows me here how to build the URL to invoke that endpoint. It's a get, how to pass the parameters, and it also executes it, so I can test it here. So an Angular developer, a React developer, which doesn't work with Delphi, you can provide him this user interface, this URL here, this documentation. This is the documentation, so he or she knows which endpoints your server has and how to use each of them, which is the URL, what's the JSON format, etc. So this is another automatic documentation feature from Xdata. So what is the advantage of Xdata? With just a few lines of code, with just the normal Pascal development, this is just Pascal code that you are writing here, but just with a few lines of code here, you have a lot of documentation. Besides your REST server working, of course, you already have a lot of documentation already done for you with minimal efforts. All right. Well, this is a feature that is already available in Xdata for a long time, but recently another feature, very interesting feature, was added to Xdata, which also has the same philosophy of don't repeat yourself, reuse your work. For example, Delphi and a lot of other development languages, this is just Delphi, not Xdata related, has the feature of XML documentation via comments, XML comments. How does it work? You just, before your method declaration, you just type some comments in a specific format here. I just paste it here. So in this example here, we'll write, for example, 3 slashes and tags, XML tags, summary/summary, and between the tags you write the summary of the method. Inside the remarks tags you write the remarks or longer description of the method, and you can even document each parameter specifically using the param tag. So you write in this specific format. Which uses Delphi make of it? Well, first, this is in your source code, so any developer reading your source code can already see a documentation of the method. Second, Delphi makes use of it for the help inside. For example, if I go back to the client here, let's say I'm the client developer, I'm trying to use the interface method, the scene method, for example, and there it is. Delphi uses that XML comments and display to me as a help inside. So I, as the client developer, already have the documentation for me. Besides the list of the methods that I have, I also have the explanation of the method, the remarks, which parameters I have to use. This is documentation of the method. Okay? This is something that you can use, you should use in all your source code to document your source code regardless of Xdata use. But with Xdata, the developer already has these benefits. The documentation you use for your internal source code, your client developer using Xdata already can make use of it without any extra effort, because he is using the interface as a regular Delphi method. So it's very handy for those who are writing clients with Delphi. But if I want to use the same information, the same documentation in the Swagger documentation, which is targeted for non-Delphi users, this is also possible. This XML here, which Delphi generates, I can go here to the server with one single line of code. I will paste it here, which is this txdataModelBuilder.load XML doc. It will, if I close my server and run it again, there we go. It gets the XML comments and use it as the documentation of my Swagger. I don't have to here write an extra content specifically for the Swagger. So I documented my own source code that was used for the client developer in Delphi, and the same comment is also being used for the API documentation, which is target for the React or even your end user if your API is public. So here we have the remarks, the content that is in the remarks, the content which is inside the param tags. Everything is integrated and being reused for several different things. So it's very easy to write your documentation without having to write a specific documentation for the API. But even so, if for some reason I want to use a different content for the Delphi client developer, which is calling the methods directly, and the Swagger content, which is target for a different developer, you can do that as well. You can use different content. So for example, in the method add here, I have, optionally, I can have the documentation, the normal regular Delphi documentation for the help inside. So this one with summary tag param will be used for the help inside, for the client Delphi developer. And I can use Swagger specific tags here, this is Xdata, to build a specific content for the Swagger. So for example, if I go back to the client and try to use as the client Delphi Client Developer, open Help Insight. I can see here that it's bringing the documentation for the Help Insight. So, for example, I have even write it here explicitly, description for a parameter, only method documentation, doesn't appear in Swagger. That's why I wrote here in the tag. The same here for the summary. It's not used for Swagger because we are using the Swagger tag for the summary. If I run the server again, there, in the add method, you see that the documentation is specific. It even has a formatting. I can use Markdown format, so this is more better formatted. It is a specific test for the Swagger. So I have the two options. I can write a single comments documentation that I can reuse in both Client Help Insights, Delphi Help Insight, and Swagger. Or if I want something more detailed, I can write different documentations for the Delphi developers and for the Swagger developers that are using a direct call to the API. Here also I have the parameter, the summary, the topic title, the parameter contents, all specific for Swagger. And I can, of course, make the documentation even better. I reverted the original code. This is a demo that is available in the Xdata installation. So we have all the documentation here. So it has something else. I will show the final documentation here, how it looks. So you can change the title. I call it Mathematics API. I can write a description, a logo, a description. I can write comments about the groups, the tags. So I have arithmetic, give names to these groups, arithmetic, put a comment, and then, so common arithmetic operations. So the documentation gets much more rich and detailed, always from the comments, XML comments. As a final comment, note something here. This is a graphical user interface for the Swagger user interface which Xdata provides in this OpenAPI/swagger.json. So this is the Swagger specification. It's a specific JSON content. With this JSON, I can use a huge ecosystem that makes use of it. For example, I can use this JSON to source code generators that generate proxy clients for .NET, Flutter, Dart in case, and even other tools that generate documentation. For example, the Redoc tool, it's another tool. If I open the online demo for Redoc, I can simply paste the URL of that JSON, and which contains the JSON content of the Swagger, and it will generate on the fly a documentation for my API that you can also provide to your end user. It's the same content, but in a different format. In a different format, the endpoints here listed, how to call them, the parameters A and B that are required for the add method to work. So it just got the JSON content and built a different user interface. So this is an example of the Swagger ecosystem. There's a lot of tools that make use of that Swagger JSON and do a lot of things. So I'm just generating my API documentation using a different format, using a different tool. All right. So this is the philosophy with Xdata. You create your REST server in a very easy way using interfaces, just Pascal code, and still reuse the comments and documentation you make for your own source codes. You already have your automatic documentation, and if you add XML comments in your code that you should do, such comments will be reused in both client development in Delphi for the helping site, and in the Swagger API. If you found this interesting, go to tmssoftware.com website, download the free Xdata trial. You can use it, it's fully functional. Watch our videos in our channel, subscribe to TMS Software channel, get in contact with us to learn more about Xdata. Thank you.